The road from Munich runs southeast through Upper Bavaria in a long, gradual descent, and in the late autumn of 1967, it carried the ordinary traffic of a prosperous West German state, going about its business. Farmland stretched out on either side in the November light. The fields already turned from their harvest colors to the flattened browns and grays that the season brings to that part of the continent. The road continued through small market towns and past the edges of pine forest, and if a traveler kept along it long enough, the land began to change, growing quieter and more particular. And then the Inn River appeared below, its surface wide and cold, and carrying the flat pewter light of a Bavarian November downstream toward the Austrian border, and the town of Rosenheim came into view on the bank above it, settled and commercial and unhurried, going about its working day. Rosenheim was not a large place, but it was not a quiet one. It sat approximately 60 kilometers southeast of Munich, close enough to the capital to participate in the economic currents flowing outward from it during those post-war years, and far enough south and east to have its own settled character, a market town with deep roots in the region's agricultural and trading history, its center built around the long rectangular Max Joseph Platz and the streets running off it. Its commercial life carried on in the offices and shops of a town that had survived the war in better condition than many of its neighbors, and had moved with the rest of Bavaria into the remarkable expansion of the Wirtschaftswunder with considerable energy. The buildings of the center were solid and functional in the manner of Bavarian market town architecture, 4 and 5 stories of rendered masonry, shop fronts at street level, offices and apartments above, the whole arranged around the public square where market days had been held for centuries and continued to be held still. The inn ran below the town, cold and purposeful, carrying its load of snowmelt and autumn rain southeast toward where it would join the Danube, and from certain streets above the river embankment, a traveler could look down and see the water moving, wide and steady, and without particular drama, the river of a region that had learned to regard its own landscape with a kind of settled familiarity. It was in this town, in a building on one of the streets running off the commercial center, that Adam Schneider maintained his law office. The precise address has not become famous. What happened inside it over the course of several months in 1967 and into the early part of 1968 has become, in the literature of documented inexplicable events, one of the more carefully recorded cases of its kind. The Rosenheim case, named for the town and for the office, and for the thoroughly unremarkable professional world in which the events were embedded. But none of that was known yet in the autumn of 1967. In the autumn of 1967, the office was simply an office, a working West German legal practice, fully occupied with the property transactions and civil disputes and professional correspondence of a regional clientele that had grown steadily more prosperous throughout the decade. Schneider's practice served the kind of clients that a law office in a mid-sized Bavarian commercial town could expect to accumulate during those particular years. Bavaria had become one of the most economically dynamic states in West Germany by the middle of the 1960s. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that had rebuilt West Germany from post-war ruin into one of the most productive economies in Europe, had distributed its effects unevenly, and Bavaria had caught a considerable share. Industrial firms had moved into the state, bringing with them the property transactions, employment contracts, commercial disputes, and civil matters that generated steady work for lawyers throughout the region. The professional and commercial class of a town like Rosenheim, the business owners, the property holders, the tradespeople who had built their enterprises up through the previous 2 decades, had accumulated the ordinary legal requirements of a prosperous community, and offices like Schneider's handled those requirements as a matter of daily routine. The rooms that Schneider's practice occupied had the appearance and atmosphere of a West German professional office of the period, which is to say, they had the slightly formal, slightly austere quality that serious commercial premises tended to carry in that decade, softened by the accumulated details of a working space where the same people had spent their days for long enough to make it feel inhabited. Heavy wooden desks occupied the principal rooms, solid enough that no one could have moved them without considerable effort, their surfaces worn to the particular smoothness that comes from years of paper and files and forearms and coffee cups. The document shelves ran along the walls, deep shelves holding the bound volumes of legal records and the cardboard folders of active files, each folder labeled in the precise hand of whoever had charge of that aspect of the office's administration. Legal work in that era generated considerable paper, and the shelves held the physical record of years of it. Correspondence tied in ribbon, property documents bound in stiff covers, the accumulated archive of a regional legal practice that had been building its records for as long as the office had existed. Filing cabinets stood against the walls in the administrative rooms, their steel drawers running in rows, each drawer labeled with a range of names or case numbers in the system the office used to track its work. The cabinets were the practical infrastructure of the practice, the place where the active work of the office was stored in a form that could be retrieved quickly, added to and cross-referenced against the bound archive on the shelves. They were entirely ordinary objects, entirely familiar in any professional office of the period, and they are worth noting here only because the setting they helped to create, ordered, systematic, professionally legible, is the setting against which everything else in this account should be understood. This was a place organized around the proposition that things had their proper locations, that documents could be found when they were needed, that the physical world of the office would remain arranged in the way it had been arranged the evening before, and that nothing in the rooms would behave in any manner other than the entirely predictable manner in which desks and shelves and filing cabinets and ceiling lights reliably behave. The fluorescent strip lights mounted flush to the ceilings were the standard lighting of a West German commercial office. In 1967, the long white tubes set in their metal housing, the ballast units humming at a frequency so constant and familiar that the people who worked beneath them had long since stopped hearing it. The hum was the background note of every working hour, steady, practical, faintly institutional, the sound of a space dedicated to the movement of paper and the keeping of records and the orderly management of the affairs of a clientele that expected its law office to function without incident. The lights cast their pale and even illumination across the desks and the shelves and the surface of the photocopier that sat in the workroom off the main secretarial area, a piece of equipment that represented a genuine practical advance for an office of this size, allowing documents to be reproduced without the slower and more chemical-dependent process of the document developing machine that also occupied a worktop in the back office. The developing machine was a more complex piece of apparatus than the photocopier. Its operation involved chemical processing fluids held in sealed internal tanks, and the freshly developed pages it produced came out warm and carrying a faint chemical smell that had become as familiar a part of the back office atmosphere as the hum of the fluorescent lights was everywhere else. The secretarial room held typewriters. The sound of them carried throughout the office during working hours, the particular clatter of professional typing, fast and confident, punctuated by the bell of the carriage return and the mechanical thud of the platen advancing. the rhythm of correspondence being produced at the pace that a busy law office required. Schneider's private office was separated from the secretarial area by a door, and when the door was closed, the typewriter sounds came through it as a kind of textured background noise, close enough to be present, muffled enough to allow the concentrated attention that reviewing a legal file or conducting a client consultation demanded. The consultation chair sat across the desk from Schneider's own position, angled slightly toward the desk in the manner of a chair that was frequently occupied by people arriving with a problem that needed to be set out and examined. A legal file would be open on the blotter. The afternoon light would come in at whatever angle the season allowed. The office had the feel of a space in which the same essential transaction, a person with a problem, a professional with the knowledge and authority to address it, had been repeated so many times that the room itself had taken on the settled atmosphere of a space entirely suited to its purpose. Schneider employed a small staff. The precise number and composition of his clerical and secretarial team during the relevant period has been described in various accounts of the events that followed, but the essential character of the working arrangement was that of a busy regional practice, a principal solicitor supported by the administrative and secretarial staff required to manage the correspondence, the client telephone calls, the document reproduction, and the reception of clients arriving at the office for appointments. The staff carried out their work in the way that the staff of similar offices throughout Bavaria carried out their work during those years, with the professional competence and daily routine that a functioning practice required, arriving at the beginning of the working day, managing the morning post and the morning calls, working through the files that required attention, keeping the calendar of appointments, and at the end of the afternoon, leaving the office in the condition they would expect to find it the following morning, the files replaced in their drawers, the desks cleared, the typewriter covers replaced, the light switched off as the last person left through the door. The working day of a regional law office in West Germany in 1967 had a particular texture that is worth sitting with for a moment. The routines of professional administrative life in that era were considerably more paper-intensive and considerably less electronically mediated than anything that came later, which meant that the physical environment of the office, the shelves, the cabinets, the machines, the desks, carried a weight and presence that later offices, with their screens and networks and digital archives, have distributed differently. Every document that needed to be duplicated was duplicated through a physical process, either by the photocopier or the developing machine. Every letter that needed to be sent was typed and handled and folded and stamped and posted. Every telephone call that was made or received was made or received through the office switchboard, and the record of calls was kept in the ordinary way, itemized on the billing documentation that arrived from the telephone company at the end of each billing period, listing each call made, its destination, its duration, its cost. These records were simply part of the administrative infrastructure of a well-run office, no different in kind from any other piece of professional documentation, filed and consulted and paid without particular notice. The autumn of 1967 was, by all available accounts, a normal season in the working life of Schneider's office, up until the point when it stopped being normal. The precise date on which the first anomaly was noticed has not been fixed with certainty, but the general period, late autumn, as the light shortened and the weather of Upper Bavaria turned toward its winter character, is consistent across the accounts. The first thing that was noticed was something very small, the kind of detail that a busy office can absorb for a while before it rises to the level of requiring action. The fluorescent tubes in the ceiling began failing, not dramatically, not all at once, not in any way that announced itself as requiring immediate attention. They simply burned out and had to be replaced, and burned out again more quickly than could be explained by normal use. A fluorescent tube in a properly maintained office might be expected to last for many months. These were failing in days, or in a matter of weeks, and the rate at which they failed was accelerating rather than stabilizing. The electrician who came to replace them found nothing amiss in the fittings or the wiring. The tubes were replaced, and the lights burned steadily for a time, and then another tube failed, and then another, at a rate that the electrician, who had presumably replaced a great many fluorescent tubes in his professional life, could not account for through any explanation related to the condition of the electrical installation. The office called him back. He came. He replaced the tubes. He checked the wiring. He found nothing. The tubes failed again. Fuses began to blow. The fuse box on the side wall of the building, a functional piece of infrastructure as unremarkable as any other fuse box in any other commercial building on that street, began losing fuses at a rate that could not be attributed to the ordinary demands of the office's electrical system. Fuses blow when a circuit is overloaded, or when there is a short circuit, or when something in the installation has deteriorated past the point where it can safely conduct the current passing through it. The electricians who inspected the Rosenheim fuse box found none of these conditions. The circuits were not overloaded. There were no short circuits. The wiring was in sound condition. The fuses simply blew, the ceramic cartridges failing, the circuit breaking, the lights going out, and the machines going silent. And when the cartridge was removed and examined, there was nothing in its condition to explain why it had failed. The electrician would replace it. The office would return to its ordinary functioning, and then another fuse would blow. There is a particular quality to a problem of this kind, a mechanical or technical problem that resists the ordinary investigative methods that usually resolve such problems very quickly. Most electrical faults in a commercial building are not mysterious. They are the result of something specific and identifiable: a deteriorating cable, an overloaded circuit, a faulty connection at a junction box, a piece of equipment drawing more current than the circuit was rated to carry. The electrician who comes to investigate a blown fuse expects to find one of these things, and in the ordinary run of commercial electrical problems, one of these things is what is found. The problem in Schneider's office was that the ordinary run of investigation kept ending in the same place. The open panel of the fuse box, the replaced cartridge, the careful check of the circuits, and the finding of nothing that should have caused the fuse to blow. The problem kept happening. The explanation kept not arriving. The power utility for the Rosenheim area was contacted. This was the natural next step for an office experiencing persistent, unexplained electrical failures. If the internal wiring in fuse box had been checked and found sound, then the incoming supply from the utility might be the source of the problem. Surges in the supply voltage, fluctuations in the current, variations in the quality of the power being delivered to the building, any of these could potentially cause the kind of repeated fuse failures and tube burnouts that the office was experiencing. And the utility had both the equipment and the technical expertise to investigate their supply, as the electricians had investigated the internal installation. Schneider made the call. The utility sent people. They examined the incoming supply and the connection to the building's installation. They found nothing that should have been causing the failures. The fluorescent lights continued to fail. The fuses continued to blow. The electricians continued to replace them and to find nothing in the building's wiring that accounted for the replacements being necessary. The power utility continued to find nothing in the quality of the incoming supply that explained the consumption of fuses or the premature death of fluorescent tubes. The office continued to function around these interruptions. The work of a busy legal practice does not pause for blown fuses, but Schneider was aware by now that the electrical situation in his building had moved beyond the category of ordinary maintenance problems that a call to an electrician would resolve. It was the kind of situation that occupies a particular space in the practical life of a professional office, not dramatic enough to be alarming, not resolving quickly enough to be dismissed, present every few days in the form of another failed tube or another blown cartridge, requiring another round of replacement and inspection and negative finding. The electricians who came and went through the building during this period were not reporting anything that sounded like a crisis. The machines still worked when the fuses were replaced. The lights still came on when the tubes were renewed. The office was still functioning, but the pattern of failures, the rate, the frequency, the complete absence of a conventional technical explanation for any of them had become something that simple maintenance could not address. The heavy wooden desks continued to hold their legal files. The shelves continued to carry their bound volumes and document folders. The typewriters in the secretarial room continued to produce correspondence at the rate that Schneider's practice required. The document developing machine in the back office continued to warm its freshly processed pages and send them out into the chemical-scented air of the workroom. The consultation chair in Schneider's private office continued to receive the clients who arrived with their property transactions and their civil matters and their professional problems. The working day of a Bavarian legal practice continued in all the ways that it was supposed to continue, but something in the building had begun to resist the orderliness that professional premises are supposed to maintain. Not in any dramatic way, not in any way that announced itself with clarity or demanded immediate interpretation, only in the small, persistent, technically inexplicable way of fuses failing and fluorescent tubes burning out at rates that the electricians who replaced them could not account for, and in the equally small and equally persistent way of the investigations that followed each failure ending in the same inconclusive place: the checked circuit, the sound wiring, the negative finding, the same absence of explanation. The Inn River continued to run cold and steady below the town. The market square continued to hold its market days. The commercial buildings of Rosenheim's center continued to present their solid rendered facades to the November light. And in the law office of Adam Schneider, somewhere on a street in that ordinary Bavarian market town, the fuse box sat with its panel door left open by the electrician who had just replaced the third blown fuse of the week, and who had, once again, found nothing in the wiring to explain it. Schneider stood in his private office later that same day. The fluorescent light above his desk had been flickering for the better part of an hour, not dimming entirely, not burning out completely, simply flickering irregularly in the way that a light flickers when something in the circuit is not entirely settled. He had watched it for a while and had continued working, and had noted that the flickering had the quality of something that was not going to resolve itself without intervention. The telephone receiver was in his hand. He was calling the power utility for the second time in a week, asking again for someone to come and look at the incoming supply, to check whatever aspect of the service the previous visit had not addressed, to find whatever it was that the first visit had not found. The light above his desk stopped flickering, not because anyone had touched it, not because a fuse had blown, not because the supply had changed or the tube had finally failed. It simply stopped, the irregular pulse settling back into the steady pale illumination it was supposed to maintain, burning quietly above the desk, and the open legal file, and the consultation chair, and the shelves of bound documents, in the way that fluorescent lights in law offices are supposed to burn, steadily, reliably, without drama or variation or any behavior that requires an explanation. Schneider held the telephone receiver and looked up at the light. The power utility line was ringing at the other end. The light continued to burn steadily, as if it had never done anything else. The fuse box in the corridor had its replaced cartridge, and the electrician's notes had their negative findings. The office had its working day, settling now toward the quieter afternoon. The typewriter sounds from the secretarial room continuing at the reliable pace of a practice that still had correspondence to send. Outside, and the November light over Rosenheim was the particular gray of a Bavarian late autumn, low and even and without much warmth, the kind of light that falls over market towns and rivers and commercial streets in the weeks before the year turns, unremarkable and entirely ordinary in all the ways that the working world below it is supposed to be. The inn moved southeast below the town, cold and purposeful, carrying its load of November water toward the south. The market square held its afternoon quiet. The office held its afternoon routines. The fluorescent light above Schneider's desk burned without flickering, without explanation, for reasons that no one who had examined the building's electrical system over the preceding weeks had yet been able to provide. The receiver in his hand continued to ring. He waited for someone to answer, looking up at the light, in a room that had not yet explained itself and did not appear to be about to begin. A power utility engineer unrolled the first section of chart recorder paper across the surface of Adam Schneider's desk on a gray Bavarian morning and ran one finger along the ink line from left to right. The line was flat for most of its length, a steady baseline, unremarkable, the kind of reading that confirmed a building's electrical supply was doing exactly what it ought to be doing. Then the finger reached a point where the line was not flat. The needle had lifted from the baseline in a sharp vertical stroke and returned again, the whole event captured in a band of ink perhaps 4 millimeters wide, its timestamp printed in the margin beside it, in small, even figures. The engineer said nothing for a moment. He moved his finger to the next spike, and then the next, reading each timestamp, spacing them out in his mind without speaking. That paper record was not the only evidence the office had begun generating. The chart recorder had been installed precisely because the ordinary instruments of an electrical inspection, the voltage meters, the circuit testers, the visual examination of wiring and fuse boards, had not produced an account of what was happening in the building that satisfied anyone who came to look. What the recorder produced instead was a continuous document, a paper log of everything the electrical supply in the building had done over the course of each working day. And what that document showed, when its length of paper was unrolled and read carefully, was a pattern that did not correspond to anything a well-maintained office building should contain. The spikes were irregular. That was the first thing any engineer reading the record would note. Not the presence of the spikes themselves, since electrical anomalies of various kinds were not uncommon, but the absence of any regularity in their timing or their magnitude. A cycling device, a refrigeration unit, a photocopier warming up, a piece of office equipment switching itself on or off at intervals. All of these would produce characteristic signatures in the chart record, patterns that a trained reader could identify and match to a known source within the building. The Rosenheim spikes did not match any such pattern. They appeared at intervals that could not be predicted from any knowledge of the equipment installed in the office. Their magnitude varied without apparent cause. They arrived and returned to baseline, and arrived again, and the paper record accumulated its spikes across the working day, without offering the reading engineer any sequence he could assign to a mechanical origin. The recorder ran its spool at a slow, steady speed, the motor driving the paper across the drum at a rate calibrated to allow each hour of the working day to occupy a measurable length of the printout. The ink needle rested on a pivot, deflecting upward when the current in the monitored circuit rose above its normal level, returning to baseline when the current dropped back. Each spike left a physical mark, not a reading stored in a memory, not a number generated by a processor, but an actual displacement of ink on paper, a physical record that existed as an object in the room and could be picked up, examined under a lamp, measured with a ruler, and preserved in a folder. When the engineer finished reading through the first section of paper, he set it down on the desk and reached for the next section, and the next, and the reading continued without producing the explanation he had come to find. The telephone system had generated a different kind of record, one that arrived not on a paper spool from a monitoring device, but in the form of an itemized billing statement from the telephone exchange. Billing records from a working law office in this period would normally show a predictable spread of calls to clients, to courts, to other legal practices, to suppliers, distributed across the working hours of each day in a pattern consistent with normal professional activity. What the billing records from the Rosenheim office showed for the period of the disturbances was something that took a moment to comprehend when the columns of entries were read through carefully. The same 4-digit code appeared in column after column, entry after entry. The number for the German-speaking clock service, repeating across the records at a frequency that could not be reconciled with normal office use of that service. The speaking clock was a standard telecommunications feature of the era, a recorded voice stating the current time, accessible by dialing a short code, used occasionally when an accurate time check was needed. An office might call it a handful of times across a working week, perhaps more during a period when employees were coordinating timed activities or confirming meeting schedules. The Rosenheim records documented hundreds of calls to the service across a period of weeks. And the calls accumulated in the billing records at intervals that placed them throughout the working day, sometimes in close succession, producing a total that no normal pattern of office behavior could account for. Staff at the office stated that they had not placed these calls, that no one in the office had been calling the speaking clock at the rate the billing records documented. The significance of the telephone records lay partly in what they were. They were not the report of a single witness describing something they had seen. They were not an instrument reading produced by monitoring equipment introduced specifically for the purpose of the investigation. They were documentary evidence of a different kind, the routine output of the telephone exchange's own billing system, generated independently of anyone's account of the disturbances, existing as a formal record in the administration of the national telecommunications infrastructure. The calls had been logged, the charges had been calculated, the paper had been produced and sent to the office as a standard billing document. Whatever had caused the calls to be placed, the evidence of their having been placed was not testimonial. It was administrative. The pattern in the billing records raised a question that the records themselves could not answer. Call to the speaking clock required a telephone handset to be lifted from its cradle, a number to be dialed, and the connection to be maintained long enough for the call to register in the billing system. In the ordinary understanding of how a telephone worked in 1967, a call could not be placed without a person performing those actions. The billing records documented calls being placed at times when staff members reported that no one had been using the telephone for that purpose. The discrepancy between the two accounts, the billing record and the staff testimony, was the puzzle, and it was a puzzle that neither the records nor the testimony resolved on its own. Investigators installed additional monitoring equipment alongside the original chart recorder to capture the telephone activity in greater detail, correlating the timing of outgoing calls with the chart record of electrical current and with logs of who was present in the building at each point in the working day. The monitoring produced a layered documentary record: the electrical chart, the telephone log, the staff movement record, that allowed different categories of event to be read against each other across the same timeline. When the records were laid beside each other and the timestamps were compared, correspondences appeared that the investigators noted and recorded in their working files, building up a picture of the disturbances that was denser and more specific than any single instrument could have produced alone. The fluorescent ceiling fixtures presented their own category of problem. Fluorescent tubes had a documented operational lifespan that, under normal conditions, allowed a building manager to predict with reasonable accuracy when replacements would be needed. The tubes in the Rosenheim office were failing at a rate that bore no relationship to their rated lifespan. Replacements that should have lasted months were burning out within days or within a single working day, without any fault in the wiring or the ballast units that powered them being identified as the cause. The rate of failure was documented in the office's own records: the purchase of replacement tubes, the frequency of maintenance calls, the accumulating cost of a basic consumable item being replaced far faster than any normal office operation would require. The failure rate was one matter. What was separately reported by staff and by independent observers who attended the office during the period of the disturbances was a different matter entirely, one that the electrical inspection could not account for, and that the chart recorder, measuring current rather than physical position, did not directly capture. Witnesses reported that the fluorescent fixtures appeared to move on their mountings. The tubes were installed in standard ceiling brackets, the kind used throughout German commercial buildings of the era, fixed fittings, rated to remain in a fixed position under normal conditions of use. What observers reported was that the fixtures appeared to rotate or swing, the tubes describing a visible arc from their mounted position without anyone touching them, and without any detectable air movement in the room. An engineer examining a fluorescent fixture after such an event would approach it as a practical problem in structural mechanics. The bracket was attached to the ceiling at 2 points. The mounting hardware was inspected. The condition of the fixings was assessed. If the fixture had moved, there should be evidence in the hardware: stress marks, displaced fixings, deformation in the bracket itself, or there should be an identifiable cause in the environment: a vibration transmitted through the ceiling structure, an air current from a vent, a movement in the building fabric that had been sufficient to displace a mounted fixture. The inspections did not produce such evidence. The brackets were intact. The fixings were undisturbed. The room had no vent running beneath the fixtures, and the windows had been closed. The office's photocopier and the document developing machine had both been found in states that their manufacturers and servicing technicians could not account for. The developing machine used chemical processing fluids contained in sealed internal reservoirs, the seals being a standard engineering feature designed to prevent exactly the kind of leakage that was reported. Processing fluid was found pooled on the worktop beneath the machine's lower casing on more than one occasion in quantities that could not be explained as simple evaporation or minor seepage from an imperfect seal. When technicians opened the machine's panels following the reports of leakage, they found the seals intact. The reservoir components were structurally sound. The machine was running. There was no path, identifiable by physical inspection of the machine's interior, by which the fluid could have moved from its sealed containment to the surface of the worktop. The technician who examined the developing machine on the first occasion would have approached the problem in the same methodical way that any trained service engineer would approach an unexplained fluid loss in a piece of precision equipment. Seals were checked by feel and by visual inspection. Fittings were examined for cracks. The reservoir itself was tested. The housing was opened, and the interior examined for signs of impact, thermal stress, or material fatigue that might have produced an undetected failure path. A service engineer working through this checklist in the right order, giving each component its appropriate attention, would eventually arrive at the same finding that the Rosenheim technicians arrived at, that the machine's containment was intact, that no failure path could be found, and that the fluid on the worktop could not be accounted for by the physical condition of the machine. This was the character of the Rosenheim anomalies, taken as a whole. Each one, examined individually, presented not a dramatic or obviously extraordinary event, but a practical puzzle of the kind that a competent technician or engineer ought to be able to resolve through careful inspection. Fuses blew. Find the fault. Lights burned out. Examine the ballast. A machine leaked. Check the seals. These were solvable problems in principle. The inspection process for each of them was well established and routinely successful in other contexts. What distinguished the Rosenheim situation was that the inspection process, carried out competently and in good faith by trained professionals, did not produce solutions. It produced instead a set of documented non-findings, records of inspections that had been conducted correctly and had reached no conclusion. The fuse box on the side wall of the building carried its own record of the disturbances, in the form of a series of blown fuse cartridges that had accumulated over the weeks of the most intense activity. Each cartridge told the same story when examined. The fuse had failed, the circuit had been broken, the flow of current had stopped. This was what fuses were designed to do when a fault condition arose. An electrician replacing a blown fuse would normally expect to find, at the same time, some evidence of the fault condition that had triggered the failure: an overloaded circuit, a short somewhere in the wiring run, a piece of equipment drawing more current than its circuit rating allowed. In the Rosenheim office, the fuses blew without these accompanying fault conditions. The circuits were intact, the wiring was sound, the connected equipment was drawing current within its rated limits. The fuses failed for reasons that the electrical inspection did not identify. One engineer who came out to the building in the early weeks of the disturbances, before the formal investigation had been established, left the fuse panel door ajar when he finished his inspection, having replaced the failed cartridge, tested the circuit, found the wiring unremarkable, and filed a report that documented his negative findings. The replacement fuse lasted until the following morning. The engineer came back. The circuit was tested again. The wiring was examined again. The report recorded the same negative findings as the first visit. What the engineer could say with confidence was that the electrical installation was not faulty in any way he was qualified to identify. What he could not say was why the fuses kept failing. The record that the chart recorder produced across the working days of the investigation was in some ways the most precise document the anomalies generated, because it measured time continuously and left a physical mark at every point where a deviation from baseline occurred. The paper spool advanced at its constant speed. The needle held its position on the baseline during the unremarkable intervals between spikes and deflected upward each time the current in the monitored circuit exceeded the normal level. Reading the record was a matter of reading time. The baseline was time passing without incident, and the spikes were moments when the current did something that the baseline did not predict. The record accumulated across the working day until the spool was changed and the used spool was set aside, labeled with its date, and stored. When the spikes were tallied across multiple days and the tallies were compared, the pattern that emerged was not random in the statistical sense. It was not the distribution of events that would be expected if the spikes were occurring at uniformly random intervals across all the hours of the working day. The spikes were distributed across the working day in a way that showed concentrations at particular times and near absences at others. And this distribution, when the investigators began correlating the chart record with the movement logs and the staff schedules, showed correspondences with the periods when the office was occupied and with the specific schedules of the people who worked there. The chart record did not identify those people. It recorded only the electrical behavior of the building's supply, but it recorded that behavior with a precision that allowed it to be read against other records and queried. The speaking clock entries in the billing records accumulated across the weeks of the most intense disturbance activity, and the total they reached by the time the billing period closed was far in excess of what any reasonable accounting of normal office use could produce. An office that genuinely needed to consult the speaking clock in the course of its work might call it several times a day during a busy period. The Rosenheim records documented calls that brought the total to a figure that would have required someone in the office to be calling the service almost continuously across large parts of the working day. The staff, questioned about the calls, said consistently that they had not placed them. No client work required the speaking clock to be consulted at that rate. No office procedure that any staff member described would have generated calls in those numbers. There was a patience required in following the Rosenheim documentary record that was particular to this kind of investigation. The patience of reading a technical log that was accumulating detail at the level of timestamps and current measurements and telephone billing entries, rather than at the level of narrative events. The anomalies were not dramatic in their individual instances. A spike on a chart recorder was a few millimeters of displaced ink. A speaking clock entry in a billing column was one more repeated number among a sequence of them. The significance of these things emerged not from their individual form, but from their accumulation, from the total that the chart spikes represented across a working month, from the sheer count of speaking clock entries in the billing records, from the number of fuse cartridges sitting in the engineer's tool bag by the fourth visit. The developing machine sat on its worktop in the back office through all of this, its motor running, its sealed casings intact, the processing fluid inside its reservoirs, doing what it was supposed to do for most of the working day. Then, on the occasions when it had been reported to leak, the fluid appeared on the worktop surface below the machine without any corresponding change in the machine's physical condition that could explain the loss. The worktop itself was examined. The underside of the machine's casing was checked. The connection points between the internal components were inspected. What the inspection produced was a description of a machine that was functioning correctly in a state of physical integrity that did not account for the fluid that had been found outside it. The investigators who eventually installed their monitoring equipment in the office were working through a set of recorded anomalies that had been building up in the documentary record over several weeks before the formal investigation began. The chart recorder data, the telephone billing records, the engineer's reports on the fuse failures, the service technician's reports on the developing machine, the staff accounts of the fixtures, and the photocopier. All of this had accumulated before any coordinated effort to capture the disturbances systematically had been established. When the formal investigation began and its additional instruments were installed, the anomalies were already documented. What the investigation added was a more precise and more correlated body of evidence, a set of records that could be read against each other in detail rather than a set of individual reports from different observers. The chart recorder needle left its marks on the paper with the same indifference to interpretation that all recording instruments have. It deflected when the current rose and returned when the current fell. It did not distinguish between a spike caused by a faulty appliance, a spike caused by a surge in the incoming supply, and a spike whose cause had not been identified. It marked them all with the same upward stroke and the same return to baseline. Reading the record required the reader to supply the interpretive context, to know that the engineers had inspected the wiring, that the utility had checked the incoming supply, that the appliances had been examined and cleared, and that the spikes persisted after all these inspections had concluded without producing an explanation. Without that context, the chart paper was simply a record of an electrical supply behaving irregularly. With it, the record became something more specific, a document of anomalies that had survived every attempt to account for them. The telephone billing statement, folded across its middle, where Schneider had opened it to read through the columns of entries, lay on the corner of the desk where it had been placed. The column of speaking clock numbers ran down the page in the even spacing of mechanical printing, each entry identical in its format to the one above and the one below, the 4 digits of the code repeating with a regularity that would have been unremarkable if the code had been for a business or client number consulted frequently in the normal course of work. But the speaking clock was not a client number. It was not a court or a supplier or a firm whose affairs were being managed from this desk. It was a service that told the time, and the billing record documented hundreds of calls to it across the working weeks of an ordinary Bavarian law office in numbers that no account of normal professional practice could explain away. The statement had been produced by the telecommunications infrastructure and delivered as a routine business document. It had not been generated by a monitoring device installed at the request of investigators. It had not been produced by a witness describing what they recalled. It had been printed and mailed in the ordinary course of telephone billing administration, and its columns of entries had been sitting in the paper record of the Rosenheim office since it arrived, waiting for the moment when someone would read through it carefully enough to see what the numbers added up to. That moment had come. The number was clear, the entry code was unambiguous, and the billing statement, refolded on the desk with the columns still visible, where the paper had been opened, was the kind of evidence that did not require any instrument to interpret and did not depend on any witness to corroborate. It was simply a document, a piece of paper produced by an administrative system that had no interest in the disturbances at the Schneider Law Office and no knowledge of the investigation that had begun to form around them, a record of calls that had been placed and charges that had been incurred, and a total that had been calculated, and a statement that had been sent. The speaking clock code ran down the page in its repeated column, and the page lay folded on the desk, and whatever had caused those calls to be placed remained, for the moment and for some considerable time after, a question that the document raised without answering. Hans Bender and Friedbert Karger arrived at Adam Schneider's office on an overcast Bavarian morning, the kind of gray November morning that settles over Upper Bavaria like a cloth laid flat, diffusing the light until everything beneath it looks equally considered, equally unhurried. Bender carried a document case. Karger had equipment cases, 2 of them, which he and Schneider's receptionist moved through the entrance together, while Schneider himself held the door. The fluorescent light above the entrance flickered once as they stepped inside, a single brief interruption, the tube brightening and then settling, and then the room returned to its ordinary pale illumination, the hum of the ballast resuming its place as the background note of the working day. Schneider had called Bender's Institute in Freiburg some weeks earlier, after the power utility and the electricians had completed their inspections and produced no explanation that resolved the situation. The process had followed its natural sequence. First, the practical people, the engineers with their meters and their fuse panel checklists, and then, when the practical people had exhausted their methods without arriving at an answer, the researchers who had made a professional habit of exactly this kind of residue. The cases that remained after the obvious answers had been systematically removed. Bender's Institut für Grenzgebiete der Psychologie und Psychohygiene at the University of Freiburg had been operating since 1950. It had handled cases of this kind before. The Institute had files on them, methodologies developed across years, and a working relationship with physicists who could bring instrumentation to a site and read what the instruments recorded without requiring the readings to conform to any prior expectation. Karger was one of those physicists. His affiliation was with the Max Planck Institute, one of Germany's primary research institutions, and his presence at the Rosenheim office carried with it a specific kind of professional weight, not the weight of a believer arriving at a mystery he hoped to confirm, and not the weight of a skeptic arriving to demonstrate that nothing unusual was happening. The weight was something more procedural than either of those. Karger was there because the chart recorder data that had been produced in the weeks before his arrival described something the engineers could not explain, and unexplained instrument readings were within the legitimate scope of a physicist's professional attention. He brought his own measuring equipment. He intended to take his own readings. Whatever those readings showed, he would record them. The office itself was not large. Schneider's private room sat behind the reception area, separated by a door that was usually closed during working hours. The secretarial room opened off the main corridor, and beyond it the back office where the document developing machine sat on its worktop and the filing cabinets ran along the far wall. It was a building of moderate size, well maintained, its fittings consistent with a prosperous regional legal practice of the mid-1960s. The heavy wooden desks, the stacked document shelves, the fluorescent strip lighting running across the ceilings in long parallel rows. To walk from the front entrance to the back office and back again took perhaps 40 seconds. There was nothing about the physical structure of the place that prepared an arriving investigator for what the preliminary reports described. Bender settled into the work with the particular patience that long experience in this field had given him. He did not begin with conclusions. He did not arrive with a framework already in place that the evidence would be required to fill. His approach was closer to the approach of a clinician assembling a case history. Start with the timeline, establish what was reported when, identify the conditions under which reports had clustered, and hold all interpretation in reserve until the pattern had been observed directly rather than only received secondhand. He had a notepad. He had a pen. He began by sitting down with each member of Schneider's staff in turn and asking them to describe, in their own words and in their own sequence, what they had observed. Those conversations produced their own kind of record, not instrumental, not quantifiable, but consistent in the specific ways that careful witness accounts tend to be consistent when the people offering them are not collaborating to produce a shared narrative. Different staff members used different words. They remembered different things first, emphasized different aspects of what they had seen. What they agreed on, when their accounts were laid side by side, was a pattern of events that had no precedent in the ordinary working history of the office, and no precedent that any of them could draw on from their own experience anywhere else. The fluorescent fixtures, the fuses, the machines, the telephone. They described these things in the ordinary language of people who had watched ordinary objects behave in ways that ordinary objects do not behave, and who had not yet found a way of talking about that experience that felt adequate to what it had been. Karger, in the days following his arrival, established his instruments alongside the monitoring that had already been installed. The chart recorder that had been set up by earlier investigators was already running, its paper spool advancing slowly across the drum, its ink needle tracing the electrical baseline of the building's supply. Karger reviewed the sections of paper it had already produced, rolling them out across the surface of the desk, section by section, and going through them with a pencil, marking the timestamps beside each anomalous reading. He did this quietly, without commentary, the way a person reads through a document they have been asked to assess. The recorder's motor ran steadily in the background. The ink needle moved. The paper advanced. In the sections already on record, the spikes were visible as sharp departures from the baseline, abrupt, irregular, returning to flatness without the gradual rise and fall that a cycling device would produce. What Karger was looking for in those early sessions was a signature. Every electrical phenomenon has a shape when it is recorded by sensitive instrumentation, a shape that corresponds to its source. The cycling of a large motor produces a characteristic pattern. The switching of fluorescent ballasts produces another. A fault in the supply from the utility grid produces something different again, with a rhythmic regularity that reflects the frequency of the alternating current. The spikes in the Rosenheim chart recorder data had no such signature. They were irregular in their timing, irregular in their magnitude, and irregular in their duration. They did not correspond to the operational cycle of any piece of equipment identified in the building. They did not correspond to any pattern that Karger, reviewing the data with the attention his training had given him, could match to a known source. He kept working. This was the nature of the method, not to reach a conclusion quickly, but to keep eliminating possibilities until the set of remaining possibilities was small enough to say something meaningful about. Every source that could be identified and ruled out narrowed the field. Every instrument reading that failed to correspond to a known cause moved the investigation one step further into the territory where the only honest thing to say was that the cause was not yet established. Karger was comfortable in that territory. Comfort with the unresolved was, in a certain sense, the primary professional qualification for the kind of work he was doing at the Rosenheim office that November. The engineers from Siemens arrived during the same period. Siemens was not a small company sending a local representative. It was one of Germany's major engineering conglomerates, with technical divisions covering electrical systems, industrial equipment, and a range of infrastructure applications that made its engineers among the most thoroughly trained technical personnel in the country. The men who came to Rosenheim carried voltage meters, insulation testers, and the kind of systematic checklist methodology that a company like Siemens had developed across decades of electrical inspection work. They were not there to confirm a hypothesis. They were there to inspect a building's electrical installation and report on what they found. The inspection moved through the building methodically. A Siemens engineer in a gray work coat would press a voltage meter probe against each terminal of the distribution board and read the display, moving along the wall-mounted cable, trunking one connection point at a time. The figures recorded in a clipboard log as he went. The readings were unremarkable. The supply voltage was within normal parameters. The neutral conductor was properly connected. The earthing installation was intact. The fuse ratings corresponded to the loads they were protecting. The wiring, the fixed installation behind the wall, surfaces, and above the ceiling panels showed no deterioration, no damage, no evidence of overloading or improper modification. The Siemens engineers covered the distribution board, the sub-circuits serving each room, the final circuits at each lighting point and socket outlet, and the earthing continuity from the main earth electrode to the furthest point of the installation. They found nothing that should not have been there, and nothing missing that should have been present. The report they produced was a significant document in the accumulating case file, not because of what it established, but because of what it methodically failed to find. An electrical installation inspection by engineers of that caliber, conducted with that degree of thoroughness, is a process designed to find faults. It is not a process that routinely concludes with no findings. When such an inspection returns a clean result, in a building where fuses have been blowing at abnormal rates and fluorescent fixtures have been failing far beyond their expected service life, the clean result is itself a piece of information. It means that the conventional technical explanation for the anomalies is not present in the installation. It does not yet say what the correct explanation is. It says what it is not, and that narrowing is the foundation on which the rest of the investigation rests. The telephone monitoring deepened the picture further. A second monitoring unit had been installed alongside the original office switchboard, its cable running along the skirting board, taped flat at the corner where it turned toward the wall, a small indicator light on its face, confirming that it was active and recording. This additional unit allowed investigators to correlate the call activity logs with the time-stamped electrical records from the chart recorder and with the records of who was present in the building at each point in the working day. The correlation process was methodical. Take the billing records, which showed the itemized call entries and their times, lay them against the chart recorder paper with its timestamps, and then check both against the staff attendance and movement records that Schneider's office maintained as a matter of normal administrative practice. The billing records themselves were a document of a particular kind. Telephone accounts in West Germany at this period were itemized in enough detail to show not just the total duration and cost of calls, but the specific numbers dialed and the times at which each call had been placed. The entries for the speaking clock service, the 4-digit code that connected a caller to an automated time announcement, appeared in the Schneider office, billing at a volume that the normal working use of an office telephone system could not account for. The entries accumulated across the billing periods with a regularity that looked, in the billing record, more like an equipment malfunction than a pattern of deliberate use. But when the telephone monitoring system and the physical inspection of the handsets and switchboard found no mechanical fault that could have produced automatic dialing, the mechanical malfunction explanation joined the list of things that had been checked and not confirmed. Bender moved through all of this with the same unhurried attention he brought to the witness interviews. He was a researcher who had spent years in this field, and the Rosenheim case, with its combination of instrumental records, independent witness accounts, and professional inspections, all pointing toward the same cluster of anomalies, without any of them providing a conventional explanation, was a case he took seriously in the specific way that the methodological standards of his institute required him to take it seriously. The Institute for Grenzgebiete had been established at Freiburg with a mandate to investigate exactly this kind of material, the cases that fell at the boundary of normal scientific explanation, the phenomena that resisted easy categorization and required both the patience of genuine empirical investigation and the willingness to follow the evidence wherever the evidence led without deciding in advance where that had to be. Bender's notepad accumulated detail across the days of the investigation. He recorded the accounts of the staff members separately, comparing them for points of convergence and divergence. He reviewed the chart recorder data alongside Karger's technical assessments. He examined the billing records and the telephone monitoring logs. He walked the building himself at different times of the working day, observing the office in its ordinary operational state, the staff at their desks, the phones in use, the document machines running, the fluorescent lights casting their pale, steady light across the stacked document shelves, and he noted what he observed. Mostly, in those early days of direct observation, he observed an ordinary Bavarian law office going about its unremarkable working day. The anomalies did not perform themselves on demand. They occurred when they occurred, and at other times the office was exactly what it appeared to be. The local police had attended the office during the period of disturbances, and their involvement added a dimension to the investigation that neither the instrumental record nor the witness interviews could provide on their own. Police testimony carries a different institutional weight from the testimony of other witnesses, not because officers are inherently more reliable as observers, but because the process of producing a police report creates a specific kind of documentary artifact. A police officer attending a scene is trained to record what is observed in objective terms, in the officer's own words, in a format that will survive scrutiny by people who are not present. The report, once filed, becomes part of an official record that is independent of the memory of the person who wrote it. What the attending officers had filed was a record of specific observations made during their time in the building. A framed picture on the wall had been observed to swing on its hanging wire during a period when no perceptible cause, no window open nearby, no door slammed in the building, no footfall heavy enough to transmit through the floor, had been identified by the officers present. A lamp fixture had been observed to move. These events had been described in the officers' own words and filed at the local station in the ordinary course of their duties. The reports did not offer an explanation. They recorded what had been observed. That was what they were for. An officer standing in the main office room with his notebook open in one hand, watching a framed picture swing slowly on its hanging wire, would have been aware that the observation was unusual. He would have been aware that it required documentation. He would have looked for a cause. It is part of the same professional habit that makes police testimony a particular kind of record. And finding no cause that he could record in the appropriate column of his report, he would have written the description of the effect itself, as precisely as his training had taught him to write physical descriptions, and filed it. There is something in that process, the careful officer, the swinging picture, the notebook, that speaks to the specific kind of patience that the Rosenheim investigation demanded from everyone who participated in it. The patience of recording what is actually there, rather than what the existing categories suggest should be there. Bender had that patience in quantity. So did Karger. The investigation at the Rosenheim office proceeded through its stages without urgency and without any of the pressure that urgency produces, the tendency to reach for a conclusion before the full picture has been assembled, to allow a hypothesis that is convenient to stand in for an explanation that has actually been earned. They were not in a hurry. The chart recorder was still running. The telephone monitoring unit was still recording. The building was available to them for as long as the investigation required. The methodology was the same methodology that any thorough scientific investigation applies, and it required the same thing that any thorough scientific investigation requires: time and the discipline to keep working through the data without resolving it prematurely into a conclusion. Karger returned to the chart recorder paper each morning with the same pencil and the same careful attention, marking timestamps and spike magnitudes, building a cumulative picture of the electrical anomalies that was more detailed and more precisely documented than anything available from the earlier weeks of the disturbances. The additional monitoring he had installed produced readings that he cross-referenced with the original recorder's data, checking for correlations and for divergences, looking for the pattern within the pattern. The spikes appeared in both sets of readings when they appeared at all, which ruled out a fault specific to one instrument. The timestamps matched between the two sets of records, which confirmed that what was being recorded was a real event in the building's electrical supply, rather than an artifact of a single monitoring device, behaving unpredictably. The Siemens engineers made a second visit during this period, at Karger's request, to look at a specific set of readings he had taken from the supply at the building's main intake point. They reviewed the readings alongside the data from the distribution board inspection. They spent time with the chart recorder paper, reading through the spike record from the beginning, in sequence, and discussing what they saw. Their assessment was consistent with the findings of their first inspection. The readings were anomalous. The fuse failures were anomalous. The rate of fluorescent tube failures was anomalous, and none of these anomalies could be traced to a fault in the building's fixed electrical installation, or to any identifiable characteristic of the incoming supply from the utility network. The afternoon light came in at a low angle through the office windows as the days shortened into December, laying long pale rectangles across the floors of the rooms, while Bender sat with staff members and Karger reviewed his instrument logs. The quality of the light in a Bavarian law office in winter has a particular flat patience to it, not quite gray, not quite white, the light of a sky that has put away any ambition toward brightness and settled into the long, steady dimness of the northern European winter. In that light, the fluorescent tubes above were visible as the dominant source in the room, rather than a supplement to daylight, and the regularity of their hum was the office's most constant sound, steady and unremarkable, the background against which everything else that happened in the building happened. When those tubes flickered or failed or were found to have burned out overnight, the disruption was felt against that steady background. When the chart recorder needle lifted from its baseline, the departure was measured against the flatness of the line that surrounded it on either side. The investigation worked by the same logic, measuring what was anomalous against what was ordinary, establishing the ordinary baseline carefully enough that the anomaly could be precisely located and described. Every day that produced nothing anomalous was as important to that process as every day that produced a spike in the electrical record. The flat line meant something. Its presence was data. The investigation recorded it with the same attention it gave to the departures. It was this accumulation of flatline days and spike days, of attended visits and unattended intervals, of staff presence and staff absence, of morning arrivals and end-of-day departures, that eventually produced the secondary pattern within the primary record, the correlation between the presence of particular individuals in the building and the timing of the anomalous readings. But that correlation was a finding that emerged from the data over time, after the data had been gathered with sufficient care and over a sufficient period that the pattern within it could be seen clearly. It was not a hypothesis that shaped the investigation from the beginning. It was a result that the investigation produced through the same patient method of elimination and documentation that had been applied to the wiring, the telephone system, and the fluorescent fixtures before any other interpretation was considered. Bender's handwriting filled the pages of his notepad in the short, careful strokes that a researcher uses when writing, to be read again later, not the hurried shorthand of a person taking notes that are only for themselves, but the deliberate notation of someone building a record. He dated each page, He recorded times and locations. He noted the conditions under which each observation had been made, the names of the people present, the state of the monitoring equipment at each point in the investigation. He was building what the Rosenheim case would eventually become in the broader record of parapsychological research, not a story told from memory, but a documented account assembled from contemporaneous records, from instrument data, from official reports, from professional inspections, from witness testimony gathered systematically and cross-referenced against the other sources. It was the kind of case that warranted the patience it received, and the patience it received was what made it the kind of case it became. The second telephone monitoring unit continued to record. The chart recorder continued to run. The police reports sat in their folder at the local station. The Siemens inspection reports were filed alongside the power utility's earlier findings. Schneider's office continued to operate, the staff at their desks, the phones in use, the correspondence moving through the post, the clients arriving for consultations and departing with their files. The investigation ran alongside all of that ordinary professional activity, patient and methodical, adding new layers of documentation to a record that was already more complete than almost any comparable case that had come before it. Karger noted, in the course of his instrument work, that the spike patterns in the chart recorder data showed no periodicity, no tendency to recur at regular intervals that might correspond to an external cycling source. Power systems that introduce noise into a building's electrical supply tend to do so in patterns that reflect their own operating cycles. The tramway system in a town center, for example, will produce characteristic transients at the moments of acceleration and braking, transients that a chart recorder sensitive enough to detect them will show as a recurring signature at intervals broadly predictable from the rhythm of the service. The Rosenheim data showed no such signature. The spikes were not periodic. They did not cluster at the intervals that would correspond to a tramway cycle or to any other identified external source operating in the commercial district of Rosenheim at that time. This, too, was a finding, a negative finding in the strict sense, meaning a potential explanation that had been assessed and found insufficient, and it was recorded in the case file alongside the positive observations. The investigation at Schneider's office did not proceed to a conclusion in the way that investigations with a clear and identifiable answer proceed to conclusions. It did not reach a moment at which the cause of the anomalies was identified, and the record could be closed with a finding of normal cause. What it reached, over the weeks of monitoring and inspection and witness interviewing, was a progressive narrowing of the field of conventional explanations, each of which had been tested and not confirmed, until what remained in the field was a set of documented phenomena that none of the testing had explained. The chart recorder data was real, the billing records were real, the police reports were real. The Siemens inspection that found nothing wrong in the installation was real. The absence of a fault finding in the wiring was as much a part of the case as the presence of the anomalous readings in the instrument record. Bender was comfortable with this kind of residue. He had worked with it for years. The Institute for Grenzgebiete had been built on it, on the recognition that some cases, after thorough and honest investigation, do not resolve into conventional explanations, and that the honest response to such cases is not to invent a conventional explanation that fits the constraints of what is known rather than the facts of what was observed. The honest response is to document what was found and what was not found with the same rigor and the same precision, and to let the record stand as the record. Karger, for his part, brought the precision of physics to the same recognition. A physicist who reviews instrument data that cannot be assigned to a known source does not invent a source to assign it to. A physicist who finds that every conventional source has been tested and found insufficient does not proceed as if a conventional source must nevertheless exist simply because a non-conventional source would be uncomfortable. The work was the work, the data was the data. The conclusions to be drawn were only the conclusions that the data honestly supported, and the morning sessions at the chart recorder desk had a quality of concentrated stillness. Karger with his pencil and his paper records, the motor running behind him, the ink needle tracing its line across the advancing spool. Outside the office windows, the Bavarian winter was settled and ordinary, the streets of Rosenheim's commercial center going about their working business, the market town proceeding through its days in the unremarkable way that market towns proceed through their days. Inside the building, the investigation continued. The flat baseline continued. The spikes, when they came, were marked and time-stamped and added to the accumulating record. When no spike came, that too was recorded, because the record of its absence was part of the shape of the thing being documented. It was that record, the full spool of chart recorder paper with its alternating flat lines and spikes, the billing records with their repeating entries, the inspection reports with their clean findings, the police reports with their careful descriptions, Bender's notepad with its dated pages and precise observations that would eventually leave the Rosenheim office and travel to Freiburg, where it would be archived and analyzed and published and debated across the years that followed. The case it documented was not a case that could be contained within the ordinary categories of a building inspection or a utility investigation. It required a different kind of attention. We received that attention from people with the training and the patience to give it. Over the weeks that they spent in the offices of Adam Schneider's Rosenheim practice, the work of arriving at those findings had been methodical, undramatic, and thorough. It had been the work of people following a procedure rather than a feeling, checking each hypothesis against the available data and moving to the next when the data did not support it, keeping detailed records and cross-referencing them carefully, maintaining the same professional composure in the face of genuinely anomalous readings that they would have maintained in the face of ordinary ones. The composure was not indifference. It was the product of a method that understood that the way a case is documented is as important as the case itself, that a finding without a reliable record to support it is not in any useful sense a finding at all, that understanding was evident in everything the investigators brought to the Rosenheim office and in everything they produced while they were there. The chart recorder data, the cross-referenced telephone logs, the cross-referenced staff attendance records, the Siemens engineers in their gray work coats, pressing their probe contacts carefully into the distribution board terminals, the police officers with their notebooks, Bender with his pen, writing in the careful hand of a researcher, building a record that would outlast the investigation, Karger with his pencil, marking timestamps on chart recorder paper in a Bavarian law office in the winter of 1967, finding in the ink spikes a set of questions that the data documented clearly and that the data, for all its precision, did not answer. The police officer's written report sat in a manila folder on the desk of the local station, the words describing the swinging lamp written in the officer's own hand, in the plain language of a trained observer recording what he had seen and not seen, with the date and the time and his signature at the bottom of the page. The lamp had moved. No cause had been present. The officer had written that down. The folder held the page. The page held the words, patient and level and precise, waiting in their folder at the station desk with the unhurried permanence of a record that has been properly made and has nothing left to prove. In the working notes that Hans Bender kept during the Rosenheim investigation, there is a passage that describes a specific afternoon, the hour when he and Friedbert Kerger first laid the chart recorder printouts alongside the staff timesheet and moved their fingers down each column in parallel. The ink spikes on the recorder paper and the handwritten arrival times on the timesheet had the same shape when held next to each other. Not identical, not perfectly synchronized, but close enough that neither man spoke for a moment when they saw it. Bender wrote a single line beneath the date in his notes. The pattern he recorded had a center. That center was a 19-year-old woman named Annemarie Schaberl. She had been working at Adam Schneider's office as a secretarial assistant since sometime before the disturbances began in the autumn of 1967. Her work was the ordinary work of that position, managing correspondence, receiving callers, operating the telephone switchboard, producing documents on the typewriter that stood on the left side of her desk. She was local to Rosenheim. She had no documented connection to parapsychological research, no prior involvement in any reported incident of this kind, no record of having made any claim about the phenomena before investigators connected her name to them. She was, by all available accounts, a clerical employee in a regional law office, doing her job in the ordinary way, and the disturbances had begun occurring around her without any action on her part that anyone observed or recorded. What investigators noted first was not the person, but the gap. The chart recorder had been running continuously, and its paper spool contained the complete record of every current spike it had detected since installation. That record had visible structure once Karger and Bender looked for it. The spikes clustered. They did not distribute evenly across the hours of the working day. They concentrated in particular windows of time, and those windows corresponded, when checked against the office attendance records, with the hours when Schaberl was present in the building. The record of her absences was equally legible. Lunch breaks appeared in the recorder paper as periods of flat baseline. Days when Schaberl was absent through illness appeared as long, uninterrupted stretches of ordinary electrical flatness. The equipment ran, the lights burned, the fuses held. The baseline continued without interruption until she returned, and then, within a short interval of her arrival, the needle would lift again. Bender was careful in his notes about how he described this observation. He did not frame it as proof. He framed it as a correlation that required attention, a pattern visible in the data that any careful reading of the records would produce, regardless of what one believed about its meaning. The timestamps were not his. The attendance records were not his. The correlation existed in documents that had been created for independent purposes by people who had not been looking for it. He and Karger had simply placed those documents beside each other and read what they said. The mornings are worth imagining at a certain pace. Schaberl would arrive, as she always had, and hang her coat on the rack beside the reception door, and take her place at the secretarial desk, and begin the day's work. The office was the same office it had always been, the wooden desks, the document shelves, the filing cabinets lined against the wall, the fluorescent strips mounted to the ceiling above every room. By the time the investigation had reached this stage, the monitoring equipment had become part of the room's familiar landscape. The chart recorder ran on its shelf. The additional telephone monitoring unit sat beside the switchboard with its indicator light confirming its operation. There was always someone from the investigation present somewhere in the building, taking notes, checking readings, watching. And within a short time of Schaberl's arrival each morning, not always immediately, not always in the same room, but within the span of those early working minutes, the recorder needle would begin to move. No one who was present during those mornings described Chabrol as doing anything unusual. She sat at her desk. She answered correspondence. She operated the telephone. She moved through the office as her work required, to the document room, to the filing cabinets, back to her desk. The disturbances did not require any gesture from her. They did not require her attention or her proximity to any specific piece of equipment. They occurred around her in the way that weather occurs around a place, not caused by a single action, not concentrated at a single point, but distributed through the air of the rooms she moved through, present whenever she was present, absent whenever she was gone. Karger documented one particular observation in some detail. On an afternoon during the investigation's more intensive phase, a lamp fixture in the main office room was observed to swing on its mounting as Chabrol moved through the space beneath it. The fixture had swung before on other occasions. It had been observed by staff, by visiting investigators, by at least one police officer whose written account described the motion specifically. But this instance was notable because Karger was positioned to observe both the fixture and Chabrol simultaneously, and his notes record that she had not touched the lamp, had not passed close enough to disturb it physically, and had not appeared to react to its motion as she walked. The movement of the fixture and the movement of the person through the space beneath it were observed in the same moment by the same researcher and recorded in the same set of notes, not reconstructed from separate accounts, but set down as a single witnessed event. What the police officer's report added to this was something independent of the investigation's own framing. The officer had attended the office as part of a routine response to the reports filed with the local station, and he had written his account in the plain language of official documentation, describing what he had seen without the analytical vocabulary that Bender and Karger brought to their own notes. His account described a framed picture swinging on its hanging wire. It described a lamp fixture in motion. It described these as things he had observed while standing in the room, in the presence of the office staff, and it placed those observations within a specific time and date. The officer had not gone to the office looking for these things. He had gone in the ordinary course of his duties, and he had written down what he saw. Alongside the instrumental and observational record, there was something else that investigators paid attention to, something less precisely measurable, but consistently present in the contemporaneous accounts. Chabrol, during the period of the disturbances, was not well. The accounts describe her as unhappy in a way that went beyond ordinary workplace dissatisfaction. The precise nature and source of that unhappiness is not fully recorded in the surviving documentation, and it would not be accurate to characterize it with more specificity than the accounts themselves provide. What is recorded is that Hans Bender, who had worked with cases of this kind for many years from his position at the University of Freiburg, regarded her emotional state as significant, not incidental to the investigation, but connected to it in a way he had observed in other instances he had studied. He connected the pattern at Rosenheim to a broader category of documented cases in which a specific kind of personal distress appeared to coincide with physical anomalies in the surrounding environment. It is worth pausing on what it would have been like to be Annemarie Chabrol during those months, held at an honest distance from speculation about inner experience, but close enough to the documented circumstances to recognize their weight. She was 19. She was doing clerical work in a regional law office, a job that carried no particular distinction, in a town she had grown up in the middle of a working life that had barely begun. The office she worked in had become, through no choice of her own, a site of investigation filled with recording equipment, attended by physicists and parapsychologists and engineers, visited by police officers and utility technicians, reported on in local and eventually national press. Every morning she arrived at work, and an ink needle somewhere in the building began to move. Every lunch hour she left, and the needle went flat. Every illness she spent at home coincided with a day on which nothing unusual happened in the rooms she was absent from. She was the center of something that no one had explained to her, that no one had asked her to be part of, and that she had not produced through any action anyone could identify or describe. Bender's notes from conversations with Chevril during this period are not quoted in full in the publicly available record, and what survives is filtered through the framing of an investigator with his own interpretive commitments. What can be said is that the accounts do not describe her as claiming any special knowledge of the phenomena. She did not present herself as capable of controlling them. She did not advance any explanation for their occurrence. She appears in the available accounts as someone who was present while something happened around her, and who found that presence as bewildering as anyone who observed it from the outside. There is a particular image in the investigative record that carries this dimension of the case in a way that the instrumental data does not. Karger's floor plan of the office, a hand-drawn diagram made to track the locations where disturbances occurred most frequently, has pencil marks clustered in two places. One cluster sits around the secretarial workstation. The other marks the corridor that runs from that workstation toward the document room and the main office. The marks are not distributed evenly across the building. They follow a path. The path is Chabril's ordinary route through the working day, the route between her desk and the places her work took her. The disturbances, charted on paper, describe the geography of a day's clerical work as if they had no other map to follow. Investigators during this phase were attentive to the possibility of deliberate production. The investigation had been designed from the beginning to apply systematic elimination, and this included the possibility that the phenomena were being generated intentionally by someone in the office, whether for personal reasons or in response to the attention the investigation itself was bringing. Karger's notes and the accounts that survived into published form do not record that any such deliberate production was identified. The monitoring equipment observed the anomalies occurring on occasions when the office was under continuous observation. The chart recorder spikes were not produced by manual interference with the equipment. The engineers had verified the installation, and the recorder's own output would have indicated any such attempt. The telephone calls to the speaking clock had been logged by an external system, independent of anything in the office building. The correlation between Chabril's presence and the phenomena persisted through the investigation's most intensive monitoring period, when the building was more carefully observed than at any point before. Nothing in the record of those months produced a moment in which deliberate manufacture was identified or even specifically suspected in the accounts of the people conducting the investigation. By the early months of 1968, the situation at the office had run for long enough that the professional and personal costs of its continuation were apparent. The investigation had brought attention that a regional law office had not been designed to accommodate. Staff members had been interviewed, observed, and asked to account for their movements in relation to the occurrence of anomalies. The press had covered the case. The building had become a subject rather than a workplace. Schneider, who had initially contacted the power utility looking for an electrical explanation, now had physicists and parapsychologists and engineers occupying his premises and filling his desk with documents he had not requested. Anna Marie Chabril left the office in early 1968. The accounts do not preserve in specific detail the circumstances of that departure, whether it was described as resignation, termination, or something arranged by mutual understanding under the weight of the situation. What the record is clear about is the timing. She left, and the phenomena ceased. The chart recorder continued to run after her departure. The paper spool continued to move through the machine. The ink needle traced its baseline across the paper in the same flat line it traced during her lunch hours and her absences for illness. No spikes appeared. The fluorescent tubes burned without interruption. The fuses held. The telephone registered no anomalous pattern of calls. The office was, as of her first morning of absence, an ordinary Bavarian law office again, which is what it had been before the autumn of 1967, and what it would remain from that morning forward. Later accounts, less formally documented than the Rosenheim investigation itself, indicated that disturbances of a broadly similar character were reported at a subsequent workplace, where Chabrol went after leaving Schneider's office. Those accounts did not carry the same weight of instrumentation and independent verification that the Rosenheim investigation had accumulated. They were gathered more informally, and the detail they preserve is thinner. What can be said of them honestly is that they exist, that they were reported and noted, and that they described something resembling, in outline, if not in documented precision, the pattern that had been observed and recorded in the law office on the Rosenheim commercial street. Bender's reading of all of this, developed through his published accounts and his academic presentations from the Freiburg Institute, placed the Rosenheim case within a framework he had applied to similar, documented instances across his career. That framework will receive its own examination. What belongs to this part of the account is simply the shape of what was recorded. A young woman at work in an ordinary office, electrical anomalies correlated with her presence across months of continuous instrumental monitoring, physical disturbances observed in her vicinity by independent witnesses, including law enforcement officers, phenomena ceasing on the day she left and not returning. The investigators who gathered that record did not consider it resolved. They considered it documented. There is a difference between those two states, and Bender's notes were careful about it. The floor plan, with its penciled marks, is still in the investigative archive. The marks cluster where they clustered when Karger drew them, around the secretarial workstation, along the corridor that ran from it, toward the center of the building, in the places where a 19-year-old clerical assistant spent the hours of her working day. The path the marks describe is not dramatic. It is the path of someone doing ordinary work in a small office. It covers perhaps 20 meters of corridor and interior space. It ends at a desk with a typewriter on its left side and a telephone on its right, in a room where fluorescent tubes mounted to the ceiling above it once registered, on a chart recorder in the next room, something that engineers from Siemens and physicists from the Max Planck Institute and power utility technicians and local police officers had all, in their different ways and with their different instruments, failed to explain. The office continued after she left it. The working day continued. The correspondence, the client calls, the document copying, the hum of the fluorescent lights burning at their ordinary rate. Schneider would have stood in the doorway of the main room on that first quiet morning and looked up at the fixture that had swung so many times in the months before. It would have been still. The chart recorder, running in the back office where it had been installed, would have been printing its flat baseline without interruption. The morning light would have come in through the windows at whatever angle late winter light comes into a Bavarian office on a working day, and everything in the room would have been exactly as it was supposed to be. What is left of Annemarie Chabrol in the documentary record is partial and filtered. It is her name on a timesheet. It is the clustering of pencil marks on a floor plan. It is the shape of the baseline on the chart recorder paper for the days she was absent, and the shape of the spikes for the days she was present, and the return of the baseline on the days she did not come back. She is in the record the way a pattern is in data, not as a named character with a fully described inner life, but as a recurring signal that investigators traced across months of evidence and could not, in the end, disentangle from what they were trying to understand. She would have been, in the spring of 1968, still 19 or newly 20. Whatever the months of investigation had been like for her, observed, measured, correlated, discussed in journals she may not have read, interviewed by researchers whose conclusions she may not have been shown, they were over. The office on the Rosenheim commercial street was someone else's working day again. Whether she understood what had happened there, or whether it remained for her what it appeared to be from the outside, something that had occurred around her without explanation or resolution, the accounts do not say. They record the phenomena, they record the correlation, they record the cessation. What Anna-Marie Chabrol made of all of it, in her own mind, belongs to the part of the case that the chart recorder could not reach. The image that stays in the record is a quiet one. Her desk on the morning after her last day, the chair pushed in neatly, the surface clear of the personal items she would have taken with her when she left. The typewriter still on the left side, the telephone still on the right, the overhead light burning without any irregularity. In the next room, the chart recorder running its spool through the machine, the ink needle resting on its baseline, drawing the flat, unbroken line that the equipment had always been capable of drawing, and that it now drew without interruption. The room beside it empty, in the specific way that a space is empty when the person who gave it its particular character has simply, quietly gone. In Freiburg and Breisgau, in the winter of 1969, Hans Bender sat at a desk in the Institut für Grenzgebiete der Psychologie und Psychohygiene and arranged a sequence of documents in front of him. There were chart recorder printouts, folded and refolded along their original creases. There were itemized telephone billing records, their columns of repeated entries marked in pencil at the margins. There were the notes he had taken during his visits to the Rosenheim office, the observations filed by engineers from Siemens and from the local power utility, the written reports submitted by police officers who had stood in the main room of Adam Schneider's premises and watched a lamp fixture move on its mounting without cause. Bender had been working through this material for more than a year. What he was doing now, on that winter afternoon in Freiburg, was turning it into an argument, organizing the timestamps and the correlations and the failure of every conventional explanation into the structure of a formal academic account, one that would place the Rosenheim case permanently on record. The category he applied to what had been observed in that Bavarian law office was one he had used before, in other investigations with other individuals at their centers. The term was recurrent, spontaneous psychokinesis. It had been introduced into parapsychological literature by an American researcher named William G. Roll, who had spent years working with cases in which repeated physical disturbances, objects displaced, fixtures moved, electrical systems disrupted, appeared to cluster around a particular person rather than around a place, and appeared to arise without any deliberate act on that person's part. The word spontaneous was doing important work in the classification. It marked these events as distinct from the performances of stage conjurers, or from the laboratory trials in which subjects were asked to consciously attempt to influence physical objects. Whatever was proposed to be happening in cases of this kind, the hypothesis was that it happened without intention, without awareness, and in association with a psychological state of some intensity, distress, suppressed conflict, and emotional pressure that had found no other expression. Whether that hypothesis described anything real was not something the classification itself could confirm. It was a frame, a proposed order imposed on a set of observations that had resisted every other ordering the investigators had attempted. Bender was a figure who occupied an unusual professional position in the academic landscape of West Germany in the late 1960s. His institute at the University of Freiburg had operated since 1950 and held a formal affiliation with a major German university, which gave his work an institutional grounding that parapsychological research rarely possessed in that era. He published in journals, attended academic conferences, and conducted his investigations with a methodology that drew on both physical science instrumentation and the traditions of psychological case study. He was also a figure whose conclusions placed him outside the consensus of mainstream scientific opinion, a position he occupied without apparent apology, arguing that the documented evidence in cases like the one from Rosenheim left mainstream science with its own explaining to do. The Rosenheim case was, for Bender, not a curiosity at the margins of his work. It was among the best evidenced investigations he had conducted, the most thoroughly instrumented, the most independently witnessed, the most extensively recorded. His formal account of the case appeared in parapsychological journals in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and it was received in the way that parapsychological publications were typically received, with serious attention from researchers already working within that tradition, and with skepticism from those outside it. The case attracted notice beyond purely specialist audiences, partly because of the institutional credentials of those involved, a Max Planck Institute physicist, engineers from Siemens, the local police, and partly because the chart recorder data and the telephone billing records constituted a paper archive that skeptics as well as believers could point to. There was something specific to argue about. The argument that began in those journal pages continued long after Bender completed his account and placed it on the shelf. What the skeptical response centered on, when it arrived in detail, was not a single strong counter-explanation, but a cluster of methodological objections and alternative possibilities, none individually conclusive, that together were held to prevent the case from supporting the conclusion Bender had advanced. Critics affiliated with the broader skeptical movement, including commentators influenced by the work of James Randi, who had spent decades examining paranormal claims in controlled conditions and finding them consistently reducible to conventional causes, argued that the Rosenheim investigation had not met the evidentiary standard required to establish that something genuinely anomalous had occurred. The monitoring of the office, in their view, had been conducted without the double-blind protocols that experimental science required to rule out observer bias and selective reporting. The chart recorder spikes had been measured, but the raw spool data had not been made available for independent statistical reanalysis by parties entirely outside the original investigation. The correlation between Annemarie Schabrill's presence and the timing of disturbances was, in this reading, a temporal association, a pattern visible in the records. But temporal association and causal connection were not the same thing, and the investigation had not demonstrated the latter. These were not trivial objections. They were the standard tools of careful scientific scrutiny applied to a body of evidence that had been gathered in an active working office rather than a controlled laboratory. The investigators had come to the Rosenheim premises after the disturbances had already begun, and they had worked within the constraints of a building that continued to operate as a law office throughout their presence. The conditions were not ideal for scientific measurement. They rarely were in cases of this kind, The question of whether those conditions were adequate to support the conclusions drawn from them was, and remained, genuinely open. Among the specific alternative explanations that skeptical investigators proposed, electromagnetic interference from external sources occupied a prominent position. Rosenheim was a commercial town with a working tram network and tramway power systems running on direct current drawn from overhead lines could produce electromagnetic fields that might, in theory, affect sensitive electrical equipment in nearby buildings. The chart recorder spikes, on this account, might not be recording internal electrical anomalies at all, but rather the signature of fluctuating current in the external tramway infrastructure being picked up by the monitoring equipment. The same general category of explanation covered railway power systems and the various other sources of electromagnetic radiation that characterized any mid-sized German market town in the 1960s. Some researchers proposed that vibrations from road traffic or nearby construction could account for the movement of suspended lamp fixtures and framed pictures, that what witnesses had attributed to unexplained physical agency was the ordinary transmission of building vibration through mounting hardware and hanging wires. Those who had been present during the investigation and those who reviewed the full body of monitoring data afterward contested each of these alternatives on specific grounds. The chart recorder data, Karger and others argued, would have registered an external electromagnetic source differently from what the spools actually showed. The profile of a tramway surge had a recognizable shape, and the Rosenheim spikes did not match it. The vibration hypothesis required a level of mechanical input that should have been detectable and that would have affected the building more broadly than the specifically localized pattern of disturbances the monitoring had recorded. The objections and the counter-objections passed through the literature over the following years and decade, each side finding the other's evidence insufficient, neither producing anything that could close the question. German public television broadcast footage from inside the Schneider office during the period of the investigation, and that footage slightly grainy in the way that broadcast recording of the late 1960s always was, showed the room as it actually looked. The fluorescent ceiling fixtures, the heavy wooden desks, the monitoring equipment on its shelf, the ordinary professional interior of a regional law office in Upper Bavaria. Watching it, the effect was of something unremarkable, made remarkable entirely by what had been reported to occur within its walls. The office looked exactly like an office. The lights looked like lights. Nothing in the visual record of the space suggested anything other than a working room in a market town going about its professional day. Whatever had been registered on the chart recorder spools and in the telephone billing columns had left no visible trace in the fabric of the room itself. That footage and the broader public attention the case attracted in West Germany during the investigation and immediately afterward meant that the Rosenheim events entered a cultural memory that extended beyond the specialist parapsychological literature. The case was discussed in newspapers, on radio programs, and in the broader German public conversation about what the presence of reputable scientists and credentialed engineers at such an investigation meant for how the phenomena should be understood. It became one of the most cited cases in the parapsychological canon, referenced in textbooks, included in course materials, returned to by researchers on both sides of the debate whenever recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis was discussed. In the early 1970s, a parapsychology textbook published in German included a chapter on Rosenheim, its title printed in bold at the top of the page. The chart recorder's spike reproduced as a small black and white figure in the margin with its timestamp just visible beneath it. For readers encountering the case for the first time in those pages, that reproduced image carried a specific kind of weight, the trace of a needle that had recorded something at a specific moment in a specific place, with no one standing over it telling it what to write. The case has appeared in the research literature repeatedly in the decades since the investigation concluded. Parapsychological accounts cited as one of the strongest examples of the recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis category, precisely because of the institutional credentials of the investigators and the paper archive they left behind. The chart recorder spools, the billing records, the engineering reports, the police testimony, all of which persisted in the archive of the Institut für Grenzgebiete der Psychologie in Freiburg, available in principle for review by any researcher who sought access. Skeptical accounts cited as a case in which the absence of controlled experimental conditions and the availability of several plausible conventional explanations prevent the conclusion of anomalous phenomena, regardless of the impressiveness of the investigators or the strangeness of what they documented. Neither position has changed substantially since the initial exchange of arguments in the early 1970s. Neither has been abandoned by the researchers who hold it. What is worth noting, with the same plain attention given to the chart recorder data and the billing records, is what the full body of official reports does and does not contain. Engineers from Siemens inspected the office electrical systems and filed their findings. Power utility technicians examined the wiring and the fuse boxes and submitted their assessments. Local police officers attended the premises and wrote their observations in their own words. Fridbert Karger, working from a position at the Max Planck Institute, reviewed the monitoring data and participated in the progressive elimination of conventional technical causes. None of these parties, not the engineers, not the utility technicians, not the police officers, not the physicist, produced a report that concluded the phenomena were the result of fraud, deliberate deception, or any identifiable technical fault in the building's electrical installation. That is a specific kind of non-finding. It does not establish that anything anomalous occurred. The absence of a fraud conclusion is not the same as positive evidence of something beyond conventional explanation, and critics of the parapsychological interpretation are correct to hold that line. The non-finding does, however, have a precise character that is worth holding alongside the rest of the record. Something was registered on those chart recorder spools. Something was logged in those telephone billing records. The parties best positioned to identify a conventional cause for both examined the evidence available to them and did not identify one. The Rosenheim town center looks much as it did in 1967 in its broad commercial outlines. The market square runs along its familiar lines. The buildings of the center stand as they stood when Adam Schneider's law office occupied its address on the premises that investigators from Freiburg and Munich visited on an overcast Bavarian morning with their equipment cases. The town continues in its ordinary rhythms: the market stalls, the shop fronts, the professional offices handling the civil and commercial matters of the surrounding region. Nothing in the present-day geography of the place marks it as a site where something puzzling was recorded over the course of several months in the late 1960s. It is a Bavarian market town, which it was before the autumn of 1967, and which it has remained in all the years since. The events that drew investigators from the University of Freiburg and the Max Planck Institute to its streets belong to a period of its life that has long since passed into the archived record. Bender continued publishing and working at the Institut für Grenzgebiete der Psychologie until his later career, defending the Rosenheim findings and the recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis classification as part of a broader research program that drew on dozens of cases gathered over decades. He presented the case at academic forums on multiple occasions each time laying out the same body of evidence in the same sequence: the chart recorder data, the telephone billing records, the engineering reports, the police testimony, and arguing that the convergence of independent documentation from sources with no investment in a paranormal outcome amounted to something that the scientific mainstream had an obligation to engage with, rather than dismiss. Whether those arguments found the audience he intended them for is a question the publication record answers only partially. The case was read, it was cited, it was debated, it was not resolved. The chart recorder paper, the original spool from Schneider's office, preserved in the Freiburg archive, holds the most specific physical record the investigation produced. The ink baseline runs across the page in its flat, steady line, recording the ordinary current of an ordinary day. And then the needle lifts, climbs away from the baseline in a sharp movement, holds briefly at its elevated position, and returns. The timestamp is printed in the margin beside it. The paper around the spike is unexceptional. The flat line resumes on both sides of the event as if the event had not occurred, as if the record had simply noted something and then continued without comment. The spool rests in its folder in the archive, on a shelf with hundreds of other folders from other investigations, the tissue interleaving, protecting the ink from further fading. 57 years after the needle made that mark, the spike is still legible. The timestamp is still readable. The record continues to exist in the physical world, holding the shape of something that happened in a working law office in a Bavarian market town and was measured by an instrument that had no opinion about what it was measuring, the parapsychological classification that Bender applied. Recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis remains a category that mainstream science has not adopted, primarily because the evidentiary standard required for its adoption has not been met in conditions that eliminate the methodological objections raised against cases like the one from Rosenheim. Roll's original formulation of the category drew on his own investigation of cases in the United States and elsewhere, and the term passed into parapsychological literature as a working classification for a cluster of phenomena that shared observable features without yet having an agreed mechanism. Whether the observable features are genuinely anomalous or represent a category of documented human behavior that conventional psychology and physics will eventually account for, whether the Rosenheim events and the other cases classified alongside them represent a real gap in scientific understanding or a gap in scientific attention, is a question that the category itself cannot answer. It describes, it does not explain. Researchers who have reviewed the Rosenheim case in the decades since the investigation have continued to find in it the same qualities that made it notable at the time: the convergence of independent witnesses, the paper documentation independent of any single party's testimony, the specific failure of multiple teams of credentialed engineers to identify a conventional cause. These features are cited consistently as what distinguishes the case from the general body of unverified paranormal claims. Critics respond that the distinction, while real, is insufficient, that better evidence than the best previous evidence is still not sufficient evidence, and that an extraordinary claim requires a standard of proof that documented anomalies in an uncontrolled environment cannot meet, regardless of how many engineers inspected the building or how many police officers stood in the room. The distance between these two positions is not primarily a matter of fact. Both sides agree on what was measured and what was filed. The distance is a matter of what threshold of evidence establishes a phenomenon as real. And that question, a question about the philosophy of evidence, as much as about the events in a Rosenheim office in 1967, does not have an established answer either. There is something in that situation that is not unsatisfying, if it is held without requiring it to resolve. A law office in Upper Bavaria in the autumn of a prosperous post-war decade began to register disturbances that its owner could not explain. Electricians came, engineers came, a physicist from the Max Planck Institute came, and a professor from the University of Freiburg, and officers from the local police. They measured and monitored and inspected and filed their reports, and when all the reports were gathered, the disturbances had been extensively documented, and the documentation had not produced an explanation that any party could agree on. A young woman left the office in early 1968, and the disturbances ceased. The record held what it held, the archive received it, the argument continued in the literature for the following half-century without arriving at a floor. In the reading room of the Institut für Grenzgebiete der Psychologie in Freiburg, the case folder sits on its shelf with the label that Bender's Institute assigned it. Rosenheim, 1967, 1968. The folder contains the chart recorder papers, folded along their original creases, the ink spikes still visible through the tissue interleaving. It contains the copies of the telephone billing records, with their columns of repeated entries. It contains the engineering inspection reports, and the police officer's written account of the lamp that swung on its mounting in his presence, set down in his own words, in his own handwriting. The folder is a physical object on a physical shelf, surrounded by hundreds of other folders from other cases, the archive continuing its quiet existence in a university city on the edge of the Black Forest. Researchers can request it. Some do. They open it on the reading room table and look at what was preserved there, and the chart recorder paper gives back its ink record of an afternoon in a Bavarian office when a needle lifted from its baseline and then returned to it, and the timestamp in the margin says when. What the Rosenheim case offers, held honestly and without requiring it to be more than it is the specific interest of something that was carefully measured and carefully recorded and carefully examined and has not yet been explained, not dramatically inexplicable, not proof of anything, not confirmation that the gap between human understanding and what the physical world produces is wider or more startling than daily life suggests, simply a set of events that occurred in a specific place at a specific time that were registered by instruments and witnessed by independent observers, and that the combined expertise of engineers, physicists, law enforcement officers, and research academics was not able to account for in any way that satisfied all of the parties who looked. The gap remains, at its own small and particular scale, in the record. The Inn River runs southeast of Munich in the long winter evenings of November and December, its surface carrying the gray of a Bavarian sky that has gone low and flat and close to the water. Rosenheim sits on the bank where it has always sat, its market square holding its lines through the late afternoon. The commercial buildings stand as they stood in the autumn of 1967, when the fluorescent lights in a law office on one of its streets began failing at an abnormal rate, and a local electrical firm came out to look at the fuses and could not say why they kept blowing. That season has been over for more than 5 decades. The files from the investigation are in Freiburg. The chart recorder spools are in their folder. The town goes on. There is a particular quality to cases that have been extensively examined and have not resolved. A quality that is different from the quality of cases that were never examined, or that were examined carelessly, or that rested on the testimony of a single witness, with no independent corroboration. The Rosenheim case was none of those things. It was examined by people with the tools and credentials to examine it properly, under conditions as controlled as the circumstances would allow. and the examination produced a body of documentation that has outlasted everyone who gathered it. The documentation does not answer the question. At its center, it holds the question. It keeps the shape of the question open in the archive, where any researcher can read it, and the reading does not bring the question any closer to being answered, and that is simply where the matter rests. In the early 1970s parapsychology textbook, open on its Rosenheim chapter, the small black and white reproduction of the chart recorder spike sits in the margin of the page. The caption beneath it notes the timestamp and the magnitude of the recorded deviation from baseline. The text around it moves through the sequence of events in the Schneider office, the blown fuses, the swinging light fixtures, the telephone billing records, the correlation with one employee's schedule, the cessation of disturbances following her departure, and the measured language of a researcher making a case. The case has been made in that text for 50 years. The page is yellowed at its edges. The ink is still clear. The spike in the margin still rises from its baseline and returns to it, the same distance from the baseline it always was, holding the same shape it held on the afternoon in 1967 when the recorder's needle first made it. The world of that Bavarian office has long since been absorbed back into the ordinary life of the town. The desks have been moved or replaced. The fluorescent fixtures that swung on their mountings are gone. Adam Schneider's practice continued its work through the years that followed, handling the property transactions and civil matters of a prosperous regional clientele. As the Wirtschaftswunder extended into the 1970s, the strangeness of those autumn and winter months settling into the past, along with everything else that passes, Annemarie Chabril moved on to other employment, other rooms, other days. The investigators returned to their institutions and wrote their papers. The equipment was packed away. The chart recorder spools went into the archive. The case remained in the literature, resting on its shelf in Freiburg, patient and unresolved, its paper record waiting with the unhurried quality of documents that have been waiting for a long time and have grown accustomed to it. The question of what happened in that office, what caused the chart recorder needle to lift from its baseline, what registered as thousands of calls to a speaking clock in the billing records, what moved the lamp on its mounting in the presence of a police officer, is not a question that the archive can answer. The archive can only hold what was measured and what was written and what was preserved, and pass it forward to anyone who comes to read it. The ink on those chart recorder spools is 57 years old. The spikes are still there. The timestamps are still readable in the margin beside them,